Hey, everybody, welcome to the Daily Objective. And we were going to talk about, how Atlas Shrugged is trending again and what it is there is to say about that. But unfortunately, you'll never believe this. I mean, I hope you're all sitting down. There's trouble in the Middle East. Okay, what happened this time? We're going to find out. You'll never believe this part. It's Israel versus the Palestinian either territories or communities or whatever's going on. I'm as shocked as all of you, but we're going to get into it. We're going to find out what's an objective way to look at this situation. There's obviously a lot of differing opinions being thrown from all over the place, and I'm looking forward to this. We have a guy with us today who, looking at him, you might assume he's himself, performing espionage with Osama bin Laden. The man himself, the guy who you all love, but who does not often appear on the show. A man who, let me add, if you super chat and voice your request to see more of him, that's the only language his people understand. I'm talking about directors of nonprofits. I don't know what you thought I meant just now. It's Razi Ginzberg.
Thanks, Rucka. And I was going to start with something else, but I will start with a correction. I'm not a director of a nonprofit. I'm a director of a for-profit.
My bad. I forgot. We are for-profit. Go ahead.
And I will also start with something that I think might become a regular segment on the show if it isn't already, which is why objectivists are not libertarians. So Nico sent me this lovely tweet by the Libertarian Party. Israel receives over $3 billion in military aid from the US annually. We have made ourselves a part of every life lost in this conflict. Military aid is nothing more than cronyism. The US government should not be picking winners and losers to fuel some corrupt colonialist agenda, which is, this is a kind of libertarianism in a nutshell, or the way libertarians think, because it starts with something that somebody who supports the free market can say, yeah, should we be giving foreign aid? That's acceptable. And then it goes into some type of moral relativism. And this is all within the space of one tweet. Some type of moral relativism of, both sides are bad, we shouldn't be picking winners and losers. And it ends up with to fuel some corrupt colonialist agenda, which says, it goes to the logical conclusion of moral relativism, which is you take the side of the bad guys, in this case, the Palestinians, and claim that Israel's agenda is corrupt and colonialist. So how it's either of those, I don't think it's answered in a follow-up, but
yeah, so the presence of Israel in the Middle East is seen as a colonial, imperialist exploitation of the region, the way that people see it. No matter what Israel does, simply by virtue of being a Western industrial, largely capitalist Western country, by being so, in violation of pristine indigenous nature, just like America is currently in violation of the Native American society and pristine nature. This is the way people see it. This is the, I guess, Rousseauian influence, among many other philosophical influences that I'm not exactly qualified to delve into, but that is how people see it when they talk about a colonialist agenda. Now, there's a lot to get into, obviously. So now just to say it right off the bat, although this will go in one ear and out the other for a lot of people, we are opposed to all foreign aid. Period, unless it's in the directly demonstrable interest of a country to temporarily fund something. Like, let's say it's Taiwan versus China. If it's in the interest of America or of UK to fund a Taiwanese Taiwanese rebellion, let's say, or something like that, then that would make foreign aid in that context make sense. But just funding a country that we like, no. Incidentally, America's foreign aid to Egypt is the same as it is to Israel. So this constant complaining about Israel gets more money than everyone is not true. And of all the countries that do receive money from America, Israel, is the least barbaric country, I think, that receives aid from America. and also needs it the least and probably would benefit the most from not getting it. Like Israel, without any American aid or dictates, would have probably done a much better job defending themselves. So this brings us to the topic of why won't Israel defend itself? So what happened? By the way, really quick, we got super chats from Fabian, from Jonathan, and from Mary Eileen, and more from Mary Eileen, all of whom want to see more of Razi on the show. So you might want to think about that. You and your CPA, when you do some number crunching, what's the best way to maximize income? Obviously, more Razi on the show. So what happened in the last couple of days in Israel, Razi? Can you fill me in?
Partially, because the details, I think, of the particular rounds matter less, and what matters is ultimately what happens consistently, which is Hamas starts I don't know if we call it war or some sort of operation against Israel every few years. These always go the same way. Israel starts by responding. By the way, these can start with rocket launches. It can start with something like what we saw in Jerusalem, which is throwing stones and rioting and so on, and Israel kind of backs down. But with the rockets, Israel usually starts with something that looks pretty impressive airstrike campaign, but is not as impressive as it looks. It's just Gaza is a densely populated area. It then goes into a ground operation, which I'm always hopeful it will not do, but it always does. And then it at some point Hamas realizes that they've done all they could do in this round, or are close to running out of rockets and of terrorists, because Israel does kill some of them. And then they usually offer a ceasefire. Israel immediately jumps on the opportunity. Obviously, Hamas violates it. Then they offer another ceasefire. Usually, there's a few of those, and ultimately there is an actual ceasefire. So, the particulars, I actually think, in some sense, need to not be looked at, because there is a clear conflict here between. As Rand said it, and Nikos will join us on Clubhouse to dispute this, but this is a conflict between civilized people and savages, and the savages are behaving as savages. What their excuse for it is I think less important. You will see some attempts to claim that they are now it's a property rights issue in Jerusalem. That is, of course, a joke. That these people don't respect property rights. So they speak in whatever language the useful idiots in the West will jump on and
yeah. So Hamas is ruling over the Gaza Strip. There's no presence of Jews, no armed security, like none of the things that you might picture, like a bunch of Israelis walking around with machine guns telling you what you can do, where you can go. The Gaza Strip is basically autonomous. The only influence it gets from Israel is it's given electricity and water, and maybe other stuff as well, but maybe food. I don't know, maybe food delivery, but electricity and water is provided by Israel, because basically, I'm not sure the rulers of Hamas would be able to produce their own electricity in any way, or to get it. However, the verb is for getting electricity. Do you pull it out of the air? I don't know. I'm on the same level as Hamas on this. I don't actually know.
We can't know that. That's not what they're focused on. Maybe if they weren't building rockets and tunnels and weren't focusing all their efforts and resources on killing as many Jews as possible, maybe they would be able to sustain themselves.
I'm not sure they'd be able to build their own weapons. Don't a lot of those come in from Iran and from other places, or have they imported scientists as well to build rockets?
A lot of those come from Iran, but a lot of those are quite primitive and probably made at home with the anarchist cookbook or something. But
Yeah.
But they are getting better. They are getting so today. We keep hearing that these rockets, don't kill anybody. Well, yeah, they're not the most competent terrorists in history, but two Israelis did die today from those rockets. Hundreds have been showered all over the Israeli civilian population because the goal is to kill as many Jews. And yeah, and of course, Israel's airstrikes in retaliation are not against Hamas's military bases because they don't have them. They hide among the population, and that means that civilians end up dying, including children. And I think I've said this before on the show, but it bears repeating. I think the one thing Hamas loves more than dead Israelis is dead Palestinian children, because those film very well. The West gets outraged. You see the outrage in the media. You'll see protests this weekend in London, I'm sure, and I'm sure elsewhere as well.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. A lot of like liberal Jews in the U.S. where I live, they're very leftist on a lot of things. So anytime there's like inequity, they say that's proof of institutional racism, right? So if, let's say, this racial group is not performing as well as this racial group, that's proof of systematic racism, as you would expect to hear from any leftist. But a lot of those same liberal Jews, they're pro-Israel, at least not as much as you and I, but they're, they ask people to have some more context. They were like, no, context, guys. Israel they want peace, and they keep on retaliating, and they're trying not to have too much carnage, but they keep getting attacked, So that's kind of the stereotype of the American Jew, who's leftist on all issues, but wants the world to respect context when it comes to Israel versus the Arabs, at least more than the world does. And similarly, I see a lot of these sort of new right, kind of former libertarians or current libertarians meets sort of Trumpian, sort of nationalist, creepy leftist in some issues. Like, okay, they when it comes to BLM, they're saying context is everything. Context is everything. The police are just trying to keep this, crime under control, and the police are responding to intimidation and assault from civilians. They stop blaming the police for everything, right? They want context when it comes to BLM and police brutality. But then when it comes to Israel, no matter what Israel does, if there's a dead Palestinian kid, that's all that means. That's the only fact that matters. It's Israel's fault. Even, dropping the fact that not only have Palestinians been strapping bombs on their own kids for decades and sending their own babies and toddlers into the crossfire for PR purposes, but whenever they attack Israel, they're specifically targeting Israeli kids as an end in itself. Like, they are targeting kids specifically. Whereas Israel, they do everything they can to minimize the death of women and children, which I'm not sure they should be doing. I think when it comes to war, when it comes to self-defense, make it clear going into it, if you attack us first, all hell will break loose. And then if they do attack you, your free country, you need to devastate the spirits of that region and make it clear to them that their government, their leadership has led them astray. That's what England did to Germany, which, again, a lot of these people are opposed to today. A lot of these Paul Joseph Watson types, they see the bombing of Dresden, if I'm pronouncing that right, as an atrocity. The German civilians didn't deserve to die. Maybe the German citizens individually didn't do anything to deserve to die, but they deserve to die insofar as their country had attacked England. So
yeah, and Israel, I mean, when Israel goes on a ground operation, this is very much the logic, because Israel says this, we don't want to kill kids even at the price of our soldiers dying, because that's what soldiers are for. So Israel definitely accepts this altruistic philosophy, and I think they are the most consistent practitioners of it in how they fight. And you mentioned the fact that Israel gives Gaza the water and the electricity they need, and the aid to Gaza comes through Israel. So Israel, everything people in Gaza need, they get from Israel directly or indirectly. So when you hear about this blockade of Gaza, the only thing Israel is blocking is people from Gaza coming into Israel. And the reason people from Gaza want to come into Israel is to kill as many Jews as possible. And, that they're still attempting to do that through tunnels. So, you know, yeah, and I think one of the worst things about this is the way the Western media portrays it, because they do know better. They know what the blockade is, what is actually blocked from crossing that border. They know that there is no occupation of Gaza because Israel, when they went really with the full might of Israel's armed forces into Gaza in 2005, it was to remove the Jews who lived there, because that was the obstacle to peace. Supposedly, it was Jews occupying Palestinian land, and back then you didn't have hundreds of rockets, showering most of Israel's population. There were rockets. They were mostly fired on the Jewish villages within the Gaza Strip. They kind of reached beyond the border a little bit. Now I was planning to watch a football match tonight that was scheduled to take place in Tel Aviv. That was canceled because the rockets can hit the stadium in Tel Aviv. So
Jesus Christ. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people in the West have a hard time wrapping their mind around the depravity out of the Palestinian territories. Like they don't share your values as a civilized person. I know it's hard to imagine anyone that wouldn't have basic decency that we see all around us in the civilized world. But again, you look at the facts. People who celebrate suicide bombings. I mean, who does that? Like, who actually celebrates suicide bombings and actually advocates to have their own family members go ahead and do it and rewards families of those? I mean, it's absolutely insane and hard for people to wrap their mind around. And yeah, I see the Twitter trending headline is like, deadly, Israel launches deadly attack on the Gaza Strip after Hamas launched some rockets. Like, just the language there. So when Hamas fires rockets, it's just literal description. Then Israel launches deadly attack. I mean, it is true that when Israel attacks, people will die because Israel is not a primitive, mystical collectivist. Nowhere on the it depends what conversation we're having. If we're here to talk about what Israel could improve on, why they should adopt Ayn Rand and become individualists. Incidentally, that would also solve their foreign policy, very closely next door foreign policy issues. But if we're talking about them versus Hamas, everything that everyone always said about the Arab-Israeli conflict, like people would say, if Israel would just respect the pre-67 borders, just give that land back to the people who lost that land. But then, like, you look at that, like, every time Israel withdraws 1 inch, that's seen as a sign of weakness, and they're met with increased hostility. Or like, if Israel would just give the Palestinians a state, well, what do you call the Gaza Strip? I mean, it's small, but it is autonomous in that they've got their own democratically elected, I think they are democratically elected rulers. They're also the only people that will ever be holding elections again. They won't ever be holding elections again. They're the only people that will ever be there. One election is all they needed. That's how popular Hamas is. They only needed one election. There's no question that they would win a re-election, right? Or democratically elected. They've got their own leadership, their own rules, their own laws. I mean, their own ability to produce their own stuff. They were even left with greenhouses and a bunch of technology that the Israelis left behind, which of course they destroyed. They didn't want it. Talk about nihilism. You were about to say something?
Yeah. By the way, yeah, there were, when Israel left, it only or removed the Israeli population from Gaza. They only removed the people. They didn't remove the buildings. You would think, the Palestinians would make some use of it, but no, it was tainted by, Jews living there. So they had to destroy it. I don't remember the point that I was going to make. So
yeah. Well, I mean, it's So it's altruism. Okay. Well, what led to all of this? There was something went on at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is right above the Western Wall, which is right where Israel ends and the Arab quarter, it's called, right? The East Jerusalem begins, right?
Well, East Jerusalem is a part of Israel. It's not recognized, I think, by most countries, but Israel, annexed it, and I think the U.S. now recognizes it, or at least uh, moved its embassy. Actually, I'm not sure. I'm not sure the U.S. recognizes East Jerusalem as part of Israel,
Mm-hmm.
but
that's where the mosque is, Al-Aqsa.
Yeah.
Okay, and there was some sort of clash between police and Muslims who were there to pray, right? There was some sort of disagreement which erupted into violence. Is that basically it?
Yeah, and that again happens from time to time, usually or often around the Muslim holidays, because that's I guess a proper way to celebrate. And yeah, Israel at some point their police backed down, and shockingly that didn't end things. And yeah, now by the way, now besides the showering of rockets from the Gaza Strip, much of, I don't know if much, but many Arab Israelis are now protesting and in support of the Palestinians, which there's a whole other, we spoke about Israeli politics a few times. There's a whole issue there. There were elections recently. There's the Netanyahu side, which isn't great, and then there's the anti-Netanyahu side, which isn't great. And they didn't want to work with each other so much that they were prepared to rely, in order to get a majority of 61 seats in the 120 seat parliament. They were willing to rely on the Islamist Party, which now seems like it's not really going to work out, because when Israel wants to defend itself against Gaza, the Islamists, if Israel wants to increase welfare for families with many children, the Islamist Party will absolutely support that. But if Israel wants to defend itself from rocket fire from Gaza, that's not something that they will stand by. So there's a lot going on in Israel, in Israeli politics, that might affect this conflict. One can only hope that it might also affect how Netanyahu, who seems to be possibly, or seemed before this to be possibly days before the end of his reign as prime minister, he might want to have some sort of show of force, for the wrong reasons, but
yeah, that'll galvanize his supporters and during wartime, people tend to like the president or the prime minister if he shows some strength, and his display of strength won't be nearly what is necessary. It's sad, but it is necessary that when your country is attacked, you need to decisively and swiftly display that shenanigans will not be tolerated. And then it's over, and then everyone can prosper. Just like America and Japan are not suspecting one another of being up to anything, America and Japan are the best of friends today because one side decisively won, and that's it. And one of the sides was willing to be suicide pilots at one point, and no longer.
And with civilians and children, if somebody holds a child in one hand and a gun in the other and shoots at you, you have every right to shoot back. And the death of the child, if you hit the child, is on the person who's shooting at you. It's not on you. And so the deaths of Palestinian children is a tragic fact of this, and a tragedy that is caused by the Palestinians, again, intentionally. So,
what's interesting to me is, so before reading The Fountainhead, so when I was in my mid-teens and I was philosophically very, very dark and angry and sort of destructive place, like I had gone through these sort of this journey, sort of motions of like skepticism leads to nihilism, leads to envy, just wanting all of civilization and all human activity to just be, done away with. Very Rousseauian, like I mentioned at the start of the episode, though I didn't know him by name, but you could sort of see how the skepticism and all these sort of lack of a coherent philosophy leads you to these places where you're suspicious of all human activity, and you see, quote, pristine nature as, the standard of value, and that, environmentalism is the solution and all this stuff. So that's where I was. Then I read Ayn Rand, and obviously she mentions nothing about Arabs and Jews in that book. And it would be many years before I would even know where she stood on that conflict, and where objectivism, where I didn't even know what objectivism was or where objectivism stood on anything, let alone I knew it was capitalist, but I had no idea what it would say about the Arab-Israeli conflict. But if I can introspect, I know, like, as soon as I read The Fountainhead and kind of wanted to just know more from this author and learn more about this author's philosophy, the dislike of Israel and the dislike of establishment, civilization, capitalism, it just went away. It's like, oh, okay. Like, it was the easiest thing to kind of switch from. And it surprises me to no end that, like, libertarians and all these alleged free market people, they just will not let Israel off the hook when Israel is, like, clearly the more capitalist and science-driven civilization, who clearly has nothing to benefit from violence and ongoing tension. And even, I mean, to the extent that we're needing to argue about this with other objectivists, to the extent that, let's say, our friend Nikos might be dragging his feet a little bit on an issue like this, I can't relate. To me, this is the easiest thing. Like, once you're inspired by Rand's work, to me, it just seems like an open shut case, but it's not open shut for a lot of people. So maybe we'll learn more about why that is.
Yeah. I actually spoke to Nikos about this about an hour ago, and yeah, he said, first of all, he said that I'm probably going to present it in too extreme I don't think he used the word extreme, but something to that effect, way, and that might not be effective, but so be it. I don't want to, I don't want to.
I mean, we are talking about him when he's not here to represent himself. Let's call a spade a spade. I started it, or you semi-started it earlier. No, I started it.
Then let's go argue with him on Clubhouse.
Let's argue with him on Clubhouse. And also, obviously, we'll be back here probably with him tomorrow, or he'll be back here very soon. And if this is of interest of him to discuss, he can. But the impression I get is that he just doesn't want to talk about this until he figures out exactly where he stands on it.
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either. So Yair in the chat says, the world won't allow Israel to crush the Hamas. Well, you're not wrong. America has held the leash, let alone Europe and the UN have held a leash on Israel for a long time, defanged Israel for a very long time. But at the end of the day, if Israel really wanted to do this, they could do it. At the end of the day, if Israel had moral certainty about this, they could do whatever the hell they got to do to protect themselves. Yes, Razi?
Yeah, I mean, during the Trump years, we've criticized Trump a lot, but the one thing that he was kind of consistent on was supporting Israel. So, I mean, I've had these arguments now about Biden with Israelis who say he's bad for Israel. Well, where was Israel when they could have crushed Hamas with maybe a little less? I mean, at some point, Trump would have had an issue with that, but yeah, Israel didn't take advantage of that. They didn't take advantage of Bush, who was better than Obama, and then complained about Obama. So no, Israel would have crushed Hamas if they wanted to. They would have. Well, they're doing a little bit, I think, behind the scenes about Iran's nuclear program, but they could have done a lot more during Trump, during Bush. So yeah, Israel, shouldn't wait for the world to let them. They should go for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to imagine that Israel can't be doing more to stop Iran from having any aspirations. But maybe I'm naive. Maybe it's more complex than it looks. But to me, it's just a no-brainer. If the minute Iran states their intention of building a bomb to use on Israel, let alone actually working on one, just literally eliminate a city every day until it's clear that that's not happening. I know that sounds vicious and gratuitous, but are you not allowed to stop somebody from nuking you? But anyway, we're not here to solve every problem. Thank you, Marilyn, for the super chat. I liked Yaron's episode yesterday of his podcast about the Arab-Israeli conflict. Obviously very timely. He was on fire, as he often is when certain subjects come up. And he goes through a history of Republicans versus Israel. So Nixon stopped Israel from from doing something with Egypt that would have definitely demonstrated to the Middle East that shenanigans will not be tolerated. Reagan stopped Israel from executing Yasser Arafat, which would have sent a strong message to Arafat, certainly, who would go on to become a villain who posthumously continues to haunt Israel with his successors. And Bush, of course, forced democracy onto the Middle East, which gave Hamas as an actually sovereign entity in the Gaza Strip today. And there's other examples as well. When it comes to Trump, I'm glad that he is, considerably more pro-Israel than others. But friends, irrational people do not make good friends. So pragmatists, evangelicals, whatever it is, you may be happy that they're on your side today, but they do not make good friends at the end of the day, long term. You really need to be ready for them to throw you under the bus any minute.
Yeah. By the way, I missed Yaron's show yesterday because I went to sleep before it started. But I think maybe some of his future shows are sort of before my bedtime. So
nice.
Do you wanna
to people who may have forgotten, you're in the UK time zone, whereas he's in the Puerto Rican one. So his evening is your, dead middle of the night. But his excellent episode. And at one point, he's like at various points, he's responding to the chat room, which is my favorite. I used to love when he took calls from people, and now him responding to the chat room is actually what I like. Even though I'm sure his accountant would prefer he only respond to super chats. I like when he responds to his agitators. And Yaron at one point goes like, oh, we got libertarians here as usual being anti-Israel. Though I don't know why. If you hold anarchy as the standard, isn't the Israeli government just the more successful in the marketplace of force than is the Palestinian? Like, what's the problem with that? And then at the end of the episode, he responds to one person in his chat room where Yaron is just like, what is this preoccupation with Israel? What is so bad that they're doing though? They kill children. Like the Palestinians repeatedly have stolen busloads of children and executed them. They kill their own children. They target children. Like, you're so protective of children, but you hate Israel more than anybody. It's just, and the guy in the chat room goes, I don't hate Jews. I hate Zionists. And Yaron goes, well, why? Like, why Zionism? Obviously there's a lot to say about Zionism, but that's not good. But like, why is Zionism the bane of your existence? He basically asked the guy. It was a good moment. If to tell Yaron's cutting team to cut out that last rant at the end and make it its own video.
Yeah, that's a great pitch for yesterday's episode, and I will watch that. But you missed my attempt at a segue for something that is happening in 1 week and 26 minutes.
Yeah, I did miss that. But in Iran versus Europe is a new series coming at Tuesday, a week from today, right? It's coming to Ayn Rand Center UK. That's pretty cool. That's a real treat. Iran, he's sort of like the Mick Jagger of objectivism. He's the guy no one will miss an episode of, and he's gonna have a weekly series on Ayn Rand Center UK, and that's a true honor. And he's gonna be debating, which is the sexiest thing, right? Everyone, at the end of the day, we talk about just promote the positive. Come on, guys, it's about values. No, it's not. It's about debate. I want to see blood. Obviously, I'm being a little bit silly right now, but he's going to be debating a different European intellectual every week. And I know the idea is to reach various Europeans. I hope the objectivists in Europe watch it and learn something. I mean, I hate to say it. I loved yesterday's episode. I thought the American on the show was the one I agreed with most. He said we need an ethical revolution for any of these political stuff to matter and be long lasting. That's what I liked. Anyway, ready to jump over to Clubhouse?
Yep.
Great episode. Thank you all for the super chats and for the chats. Please leave a like on the video, and please leave a comment on the video itself, like a comment. That's great for the discussion and the algorithm as well. We're jumping over to Clubhouse now. Looking forward to seeing you there, including some of you Android users are now joining. Nice you guys to finally join us in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's only the American Android users for now, but
welcome to the 20s. I'll tell them. Welcome to the 20s. We're in the 20s now. Welcome to the decade. We'll see you all, some of you on Clubhouse. Nothing else happening here today on the channel, is there?
Yes, there is. The Troubadour talks with Kirk Barbera, and his guest for today's episode is Nikos. They will be discussing Shane.
Nice. Shane. So they're going to be talking about Shane. It's an excellent series here. on the Ayn Rand Center UK later today. And we'll be back here for the Daily Objective on the Ayn Rand Center UK tomorrow. And we're jumping to Clubhouse now. See you all there. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye.